Welcome to Simply Sewing with Sew Very Easy. My name is Laura, and last month we talked about a flat felt seam, which is a seam that runs flat along the back of fabrics. Well, today let's talk about one of the most unusual seams, and it's called a French seam. And what makes this unusual is we sew the wrong sides together before we sew the right sides together, but it leaves a beautiful finish along the back. Most garment patterns have a 5/8 seam allowance. This is the measurement that we sew, and then we finish the edges off any way that we want. If we're making our own patterns or doing crafts and hobbies, we can do whatever seam allowance we want. So let's do a 5/8 seam allowance and a 1-inch seam allowance. When we do a regular seam, we put right sides of the fabric together and we stitch along that 5/8, the 1/4 inch, the 1 inch, whatever seam that we want. And then we finish off that one edge. To do a French seam, it's opposite. We are going to match the wrong sides together first. We will match our notches and our seams just like we normally would. The only difference is we're matching the fabric's wrong sides together. From here, the first row of stitching needs to be a very small, skinny little stitch. It could be a 1/4 inch, it could be an 1/8 inch. So I've matched up my fabrics and I'm going to stitch a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once the first seam has been done, we do need to sew it so that the right sides are together. But what we need to do is encase this seam into the next seam. So it's going to be inside. The first thing is to press the seam flat. From here, we now are going to match right sides together right along that stitching line. The next row of stitching still needs to be on that 5/8 seam allowance, but it's not 5/8 over because we've already used up a 1/4. So that distance now will become 3/8 because the 3/8 and the 1/4 inch is going to give us the 5/8. The important thing is that seam inside is covered. If it's a little bit too big, we can trim it down. So you can take off just a little bit, and that's going to clean up that edge. Once it's pressed and I know the measurement, I'm going to be able to stitch that stitch. So I'm going to do the first one at 3/8 of an inch. Once that's stitched, I have a total of a 5/8 seam allowance. I have the fabric going in the right direction, but for the back, I have a seam that is enclosed. From here, we can press it to one side or another. That seam is done. All the French seam is a seam inside of a seam. The important thing is that you do not see any of your seam allowances sticking out of the front. So it's important that that first row of stitching is totally inside of this seam. If not, you will have these little fibers sticking out. For the second part, I can do the 1 inch. I've stitched that 1/4 inch, but I did not trim it down. Now I can sew a 1 inch seam. I'm going to put my right sides together, and in order to have that 1 inch seam, I now need to stitch 3/4 of an inch from that edge over. That larger seam is going to be the same. The difference is you did not need to trim off your first 1/4 inch. When we look really close, we can see that little seam is inside of that bigger seam. And the same is here. This is the 1/4 inch seam that has not been trimmed with that larger seam, the smaller seam that's been trimmed so that we could do the 5/8 seam. A French seam is not only a very attractive seam, it is a very strong seam because we do have 2 rows of stitching. So if there's a seam that you need to have that extra strength, a French seam is definitely a good one to use. It is also good for fabric that's very lightweight. If you have a lightweight fabric that you can see through, having that French seam means that it's going to look nice from the front side as well as the back side. Because we can see through that fabric, we do want to have a nice clean finish from both sides. Another great time to use a French seam is if you're doing something that is unlined. And that way, if the unlined jacket opens up, you have that French seam so it looks nice and clean from both sides. I would recommend making a sample for what fabric you are going to do the French seam with, and that way you can judge what seam allowance you want. If you're able to trim that down and do a 5/8 seam allowance, definitely go that way. If you find that you need a larger seam, then increase that seam allowance to 1 inch. Thank you for joining me today on Sew Very Easy. Feel free to subscribe, and as always, come on back. Let's see what we're sewing and talking about next time in the sewing room. Bye for now.